Hello. So I want to address something that's happening in British nationalist circles at the moment, which is this discussion about race-based politics. And I follow British nationalists because, well, there's not that much content out there, and there's quite a few Brits making content out there. So you keep up with their politics through osmosis in a sort of way. And the reason I'm making this video is because people like Sargon and the Britisher often make this accusation that to take a racial viewpoint, to act in ethnic ways, to act in an ethnic interest, is somehow German. I'm a Germanic nationalist, and I think this is a pretty absurd idea. They also say things like to view things racially is to abandon British liberalism. I say, well, there has never been a society that more stringently implemented scientific racism than Anglo-British societies, especially America, but in Britain in its colonies did this too. They had racial caste systems. And really, this whole idea that racism is something like the Germans came up with and that was Hitler and the NSDAP, no, that's just not true. I don't like talking about the NSDAP Hitler because it's a period in history we really have to get past, and it's not interesting anymore. It's only interesting because people keep talking about it and really they should stop. But the NSDAP did not have a data-driven view of race. Generally, the German conservative movement did not view race in scientific terms. They rejected IQ, for example. Well, they rejected IQ partially because Jews scored high on IQ tests, but also because this is not the German way at the time of looking at things. The Volkisch movement before the National Socialists and many other conservative reactionary movements hardly talked about race because it's, for a Central European nation, surrounded by only other Europeans, race isn't really such an interesting concept to talk about. You talk about ethnicities, but the concept of race for Germans was very spiritual. It's Geistesgefühl, Yes, you can only be German if you're born from a German mother and a German father, of course, but it didn't figure prominently in their literature or thinking. It wasn't really big in the discussion. And if you actually look at German propaganda during the war, they actually advocated against the racial separation by the Americans implemented, and they ridiculed the Ku Klux Klan, for example. This way of racialism as it is understood today in international politics is actually a liberal Anglo conception, because it is rooted in Anglo Empiricism. It's all deductive. It's data-driven, it's statistical, and I'm actually going to give you some examples of people who are very prominent in developing eugenics, racial theories, and social Darwinism. The name kind of gives it away. Now, first, of course, the whole concept of heritability and biology as we understood it today was pioneered by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin himself did not have much in the way of views on race, but his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, absolutely did. And Sir Francis Galton developed eugenics. And he is a pioneer of concepts in statistics which we still use today, like regression to the mean. And he was a pioneer in using statistical macro data analysis of human populations, basically doing data-driven sociology before the field of sociology existed. Then another prominent Brit who was a pioneer of developing social Darwinism, which is the implementation of selection and heritability into politics in a very stringent way, is Karl Pearson, who was a mathematician. And I'm going to give you a quote from him. I'm going to give a few quotes from people here, and I want it to be very clear, these are not my words or my views. This is just a video addressing this idea that Anglo-liberalism is somehow race-blind. So, quote from Karl Pearson. My view, and I think it may be called the scientific view of a nation, is that of an organized whole, kept up to a high pitch of internal efficiency by ensuring that its numbers are substantially recruited from the better stocks, and kept up to a high pitch of external efficiency by contest, chiefly by way of war with inferior races. Carl Pearson, Brit, liberal, arguing for race war to basically meritocratically improve the population. Another hero of centrist liberalism, who was the founder of the monetary system and banking system we have today, Maynard Keynes, was also a very prominent advocate of eugenics. So he had this to say on eugenics. Eugenics is the most important, significant, and I would add genuine branch of sociology which exists today. Keynes also had something to say on another topic, which again, this is not anything to do with my views or opinion, but it is something that is a point of discussion between civic nationalists in Britain and ethnic nationalists in Britain. And Keynes said this: Jews have in them deep-rooted instincts that are antagonistic and therefore repulsive to the European. And their presence amongst us is a living example of the insurmountable difficulties that exist in merging race characteristics, such as in making cats love dogs. Again, this is Keynes. I'll give you a quote from another hero of British liberalism, Sir Bertrand Russell, who developed the concept of the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is the idea that any policy should be blind to the individual, should be universal, because a decision should be made basically without considering one's personal circumstances, but made universal so that it could apply to everyone, because since it's a broad policy, it could affect all kinds of perspectives that you don't personally have experience with. Anyway, Bertrand Russell, again a liberal, he had this to say on race. In extreme cases, there can be little doubt of the superiority of one race to another. It seems on the whole fair to regard Negroes as on the average inferior to white men, although for work in the tropics they are indispensable, so that their extermination, apart from the question of humanity, would be highly undesirable. Bertrand Russell, Anglo-liberal, considering the extermination of Negroes, and openly saying that there is such a thing as racial superiority. I don't think any ethnic nationalists today advocate for racial superiority. Mainly they advocate that there is such a thing as racial difference. And again, this is all there has never been a society that has implemented racialism as much as Anglo societies, because it is it's a very technocratic and liberal perspective. Malthus, Keynes, all these sort of liberal, and you also had Fabian socialists in this, such as Sir George Bernard Shaw, were advocates of eugenics, because they were technocrats, and all their thinking in this was merely the racialism they had was completely data-driven, simply efficiency. They wanted to optimize and make things more efficient. That's not how Germanics saw race. That's not how the NSDAP or Volkisch movement saw race. Race is an innate characteristic, something that you are. It's a fundamental part of your being. It's a spiritual conception to them, and they reject such things as, oh, go away with your IQ data and your average height differences and differences in racial sports and so on. That's all irrelevant, because you are what you are. It's not about efficiency. But for an Anglo empiricist, it is about efficiency. Now in America, and I'm talking here mainly about the 1920s, 1930s, so 1900 to 1945, because we are, as Germanics, of course, being framed as the founders of racialism and race science because Hitler. And that's why I'm talking about this time period, because at this same time there were all these people, Keynes, Russell, contemporaries of Hitler, Pearson as well, who advocated these things in liberal societies. And in my view, the most racialist society that has ever existed is America. It's a completely racially structured society, or it was foundation up until 1965. It has examples of the most gross racialism, such as in the form of the KKK, lynchings, etc., which actually propaganda during the Second World War against the Americans, one of the things that the Germans actually propagated were cartoons about the KKK, and they decried racial separation in America. So this whole idea that Germans were so racist, yeah, they had issues with certain races, the Poles and the Jews, but they weren't out to exterminate Africans or anything. These were not things that they were considering at all. But America has been, from its foundation, and its foundation is liberalism. You can hardly deny that the American Constitution is a very liberal document, and that the founders weren't liberals. I mean, America's a liberal nation. Even its conservatives are simply liberals. So you cannot argue that America is not an example of a liberal society. And that is also the best example of a racial society. Race seeps into everything in American rhetoric. And because America is the world hegemon, its rhetoric seeps everywhere into in what we talk about elsewhere. And I don't like talking about it so much. It's a necessary evil to talk about race, unfortunately. But a few of the most prominent writers of the day, and again these are contemporaries of Hitler, Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, and Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote The Rising Tide of Color Against World White Supremacy, who was incredibly popular in his day. He organized debates with black activists such as Du Bois, and which pulled whole stadiums as an audience. His book was a bestseller, and he actually visited Germany in 1940. And when he visited Germany, he went to one of the racial eugenics courts, and again, Germany did have under the NSDAP a eugenics policy, but what Lothrop Stoddard said, that they were inefficient. They were not looking at the data well enough, and they were being far too soft. They were only sterilizing or executing the truly criminally insane or the truly mentally deficient. But Stoddard and many of these Fabians actually advocated for simply the man who advocated the implementation of poverty relief laws in Britain in the 1910s. I forget what his name was, but he was a eugenicist, and he basically helped pass unemployment benefits in Britain. And he did this from a eugenic perspective. He wanted that if you want to get unemployment, that's fair and well, but then you were to be sterilized. You would not have the right to father children because you had proven your incapacity as a productive member of society. Again, the Anglo Empiricist racial view is all about efficiency. Then you've got Charles Davenport, who is also very famous as a eugenicist, and this is all 1920s. The 1920s, and was a time of extreme eugenicism in America. There was, of course, an apartheid regime where blacks had some rights, but they were second-class citizens at best, which was, in the views of Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard, the best solution for the time, and really they should be disenfranchised even more, if not shipped right back to Africa. Again, liberals. But the best example of racialism at this time is actually, in terms of politics, is under Woodrow Wilson. You wouldn't think that, but yes, Woodrow Wilson was a huge eugenicist and advocate of racial politics. The American liberal progressive movement of that time, I forget, it's New Hope, New Future, something like that they call themselves. There's this movement that combined all of this racialism, all the scientific developments from Darwin onward. They combined that with a sort of semi-socialist economic policy of poverty relief and so on, and very humanitarian liberal social values. And they started implementing that. And one of the policies, for example, was the prohibition. Another was eugenics, for example, in the Alabama syphilis experiment, where they experimented on blacks with syphilis, and they deliberately sterilized them and so on, to try out eugenic policies. And people at that time, there were eugenic societies throughout America who advocated for not breeding if you had some sort of inferiority or you weren't a productive member of society and so on. And that's the American progressive movement, which is very much a liberal movement. 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. This was prominent. Theodore Roosevelt was a champion of this movement as well. You can't say that Theodore Roosevelt was some kind of fascist, authoritarian figure, maybe, but not a fascist. And so the argument I'm trying to make here is that actually, and you want another example of a liberal state that implemented racial policies? Well, apartheid South Africa, of course. Apartheid South Africa, under the Brits, had racial separation, and it was carried on up until as an independent country up until the 1990s, of course. And that's, again, it's South Africa in 1950 wasn't some kind of fascist state. It was very much a part of the international system. In fact, it only started being boycotted and had trouble over its apartheid attitude from the 1970s onward, which and America only really ended its apartheid policies in the 1960s. So the longest running societies in the world that had actual racial policies are Anglo-liberal societies like South Africa and like America. Britain itself, of course, didn't have this because they didn't need to, because they didn't have a huge racial minority in their own lands. But they did implement such policies in their colonies, especially, for example, in India, where they carried on the caste system. So that's really the argument I want to make here, and this is aimed at Brits. It's an absolute nonsense to say that the British liberal tradition is somehow race blind. It's absolutely not. It's the founder of racial science. Racial science is descended from Anglo Liberalism, from empiricism. It's not German. It's absolutely not Germanic in any way. The German conception is just you are who you are, and there's no need to justify this with data or anything, and we're not looking to find optimizations or anything like that. There was a small eugenics perspective in Hitler, but that's about it. And the NSDAP is a fluke of Germanic history. It's 12 years you're talking about here. You can't attribute it to some sort of Germanic attitude, some Germanic worldview. This is a British liberal worldview, not a Germanic worldview. The Germanic worldview is far more... What did the actual conservatives write about? The Conservative Revolution? The Spanglers and Ernst von Salomon, Junger. What did they write about? They didn't write about race. They actually were more race blind than British liberals, because they talked about values and systems and beliefs. They talked about Christianity and the death of Christianity and how to revive spiritual values. They talked about how to best rule society. They were advocates of authoritarianism, hierarchy, of religion, but the race didn't really factor so much into it because they didn't have to deal with race. Race was something Brits and Americans talked about because they had colonies and they lived with large minorities in their countries. German racism at the time was mostly directed at Poles, and it's the kind of racism that you have, and to an extent Frenchmen, but Slavs were the target of racial policies. And this is not... This wasn't justified by data. This wasn't justified by science. This was just a sentiment of like, well, they're our neighbors. Fuck them. They're not like us. We hate them. This is the sort of brutish, blind race hatred that is inherent to most people in most societies throughout history. It's not the sort of very developed racialism that the British had. So that's really what I'm trying to say here, is that this isn't the German thing, it's a British thing. And to say that British liberalism is somehow race blind, all of the great figures of British liberalism were racialists, eugenicists, social Darwinists, and the products of British liberalism have been extremely racialized societies. And the only reason that liberalism today can say that it is race blind is because we've kind of abandoned all of our history from 1945 and backward. Well, not all of it, but quite a lot of what was at the time normal in the West has been forgotten, abandoned, let go. And Fabian socialists argued for this sort of thing as well. That's all been forgotten. I'm sure that if you looked into communist writers, you can find racialism there. All societies before 1945 had racialism in them. So that's really all I wanted to say here. That it's not Germans, it's Brits, and British liberalism is racialist.